This week we've got two chapters, and the first one is on consumption and materialism, a very interesting and thought-provoking subject. It really encourages us to think about why we purchase the things we purchase and what they mean, what their meaning is, which is also crucially important. And the way we start is with talking about Elvis Presley's uh, home and estate called Graceland. And so your text points out that it's 17,552 square foot home, if you can call something that large a home. And and as I read through the opening vignette there, I was thinking, who knew Elvis had a meditation garden? That was really interesting to find out, and I really hope that he used it a bit. But the key point is about that whole description of Graceland and its kind of overblown uh, presentation of self and status and consumption is that uh, all of us today, at least in the core states, as we'll learn what those are in the next chapter, but at least in the industrialized nations, consumes more than is necessary to survive. I think we all know that. For most of us, that is true. Um, but the other key point is, or even to thrive, not just to survive. We consume more than we need to survive, but that very consumption means we're consuming more than we need to thrive because we're destroying our ecological system in order to consume more than we need to survive. So it's and if when you did the that was part of the reason I had you do the ecological footprint, so that you could kind of get a clear picture of what that means. So why so much consumption, right? It's a very important sociological question because it relates to all three of those central issues that we've been talking about: environmental justice, sustainability across nations, across generations, and the distribution of those environmental goods and bads within generations. So we're looking at uh, justice and sustainability across generations, that seventh generation concept, and then who gets the goods and who gets the bads at any given time within generations. Um, and then what are the consequences for other species as well, not just us? So obviously, we can't all live like Elvis. I don't know that all of us would want to, like Elvis or Jeff Bezos or some of the other, very, very wealthy top 1% folks. Um, but also, and I hope this is what you'll grasp out of this chapter, we don't need to in order to be content. We don't need 17,000 square foot houses in order to be um, happy and content and doing okay, in our economic system, economic realities. So, um, why are people so greedy? Or why do we? That's kind of a trope we have, isn't it? Well, people are just greedy. Well, why? It's and the common answer, of course, to why people live the way that Elvis and other descriptions of people is that they are greedy. So, what Mahatma Gandhi said, I just love the way he thought. Uh, he said, "The world has enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. The world has enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed." And I want to, it's not in the text, but I want to tell you Gandhi's 7 deadly social sins. If you want to have them for yourself, you can Google them online. There are a variety of places where you can get this list. Okay, so these were what Gandhi said: the 7 deadly social sins, which really describe the issues and problems of this chapter about consumption and materialism perfectly. So here are the sins: politics without principle, wealth without work, commerce without morality, pleasure without conscience, education without character, science without humanity, and worship without sacrifice. I had a poster of those on my office door at the college when I was working, when I was full time there, professor, and someone stole it. Someone took it off, and I thought, isn't that interesting? Someone wanted those, unless it either it offended people so much, or this person, whoever they were, or they wanted to have the poster. But either way, it went against all of those things that Gandhi was talking about in the poster. So with those statements of Gandhi's, it becomes you can see that it's possible. What it means is that it's possible to change our feelings of greed if we make an effort to do so. And I think first we have to become aware of them and begin to understand their origins, which we're going to do in this. For another point, whether greed is natural, it's highly variable from culture to culture, as you'll see. Now, I'm going to probably refer to A Poor Man Shames Us All a lot during this discussion, the film I put up for you. And one of the reasons I keep saying it, aside from the fact that I can't wait for you to see it, is think about that statement. A poor man shames us all. It doesn't shame the poor man, right? He didn't fail in some way. They didn't fail in some way, right? The whole group failed if there is someone who is poor. And you'll see how other cultures in the film A Poor Man Shames Us All, deal with these issues, okay? So there's great variability in the concept of greed, in the practice of greed in a culture, and which means obviously that it's not natural and it's not inevitable. It's cultural. Okay, it's something we learn. That it's okay to be that way. It's not okay. That we need certain things to the extent that we'll steal them or work ourselves to death for them, et cetera, et cetera. That's the ideal, not the material. Okay, they're ideas. And it really depends on how we arrange our social lives, of course. So what this chapter does is, this chapter on consumption and materialism, it explores the social basis of our material desires. Where do they come from? How do we get them? Well, let's start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know that many, if not most of you, have become familiar with this in other classes. It's taught in psychology, sociology, and a variety of other classes. But the point, it's a very compelling theory. It's one that you don't really have to, it's kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's really pretty obvious, I would say, from our perspective. It's as your book says, and I think it's true, it's intuitively compelling because it makes sense. And it's basically, you can't take care of those higher needs or even think about them, such as knowledge and art, and let's throw in about the environment, and certainly not self-actualization, the top one, if you're starving, right? If you have no shelter, if you have nothing, you take care of those basic life, the needs that allow you to survive physically in life first, from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Well, if you never get beyond the survival level from the hierarchy of needs perspective, you never get to these other levels of, education and self-actualization and that type of thing. Okay. So that sounds great, and except that there are some obvious exceptions to them. Some are cultural, as we just talked about, but others are things like, I don't know if this has ever happened to you. I have stayed, the example in your book made me chuckle about a student who continues studying because they have to pass a big exam the next day, even though they're starving or they're exhausted. So they're overcoming those physical needs in order to get to a higher need, which is to pass the exam. So they'll study through that. So that's, I think, a very good example of that. And the fact that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is so intuitive, and it just kind of, it feels right, that it seems like it makes so much sense to us. So it speaks to the shared understanding of human motivation that at least we in the West have, we in Western cultures. But there's some problems with it, and that example of the student, you know, uh, not eating in order to study is one. A case can be made that the needs aren't a hierarchy, but that we're likely to act on whatever need is currently least being fulfilled. Okay, so that's the one that there's a deficit of, and I would say mostly the hierarchy of needs is probably correct in that it's often food or shelter, that safety, that type of thing. But whatever it is that is least being met, that's the one we tend to, or that's under threat, or that we can do something about. Okay, that is the one that is so forefront in our minds. Okay, that we will take care of that need first. So, food, for example, we seem to be using food examples, the students who study through hunger, but also as an example, relief organizations who hand out food. If it's food that goes against your cultural norms, pork to Muslims or Jews, for instance, people will refuse it, right? Okay. If you were starving and somebody served you up a puppy dog, or you were hungry in a relief camp, would you eat it? You know, it goes against our cultural norms pretty seriously. So those are some examples of where people don't just take care of their basic needs initially. Other things intervene. The other things are important. It also, this theory of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, doesn't consider the global south. Well, Maslow was not an anthropologist, so I don't think he was thinking about other cultures and thinking that broadly. But, you know, the global south are tend to be that, you know, that's non-industrialized peripheral nations that tend to be in the southern hemisphere. They're basically farmers, they're agrarian peoples, they're rural peoples, and they don't necessarily operate so clearly on this basis of the hierarchy of needs. And the other thing is, that's very interesting, is that those higher pursuits of, or higher needs that Maslow was talking about, self-actualization, pursuit of knowledge, those type of things, are stereotypically Western values. They're Western urban, they are highly valued in Western urban cultures, not necessarily, as I pointed out before, in other cultures. So what's really where we're getting at here, and what's most important for this chapter, is that the theory can't really explain, even if you accept the whole theory and say it's valid, you know, universally, then the question is, it can't explain why we consume more than we need. Why don't we stop when our, you know, needs are fulfilled? Because we don't, as we all know, okay? So theoretically, we should only consume as much as we need. Yeah, we take care of those survival needs first, but once they're, you know, then we don't need to be constantly getting more, according to the hierarchy of needs theory. And we all know that's not true. So there's a flaw in there somewhere. So let's look at the original affluent society. I love teaching this, and it comes up, of course, in anthropology all the time, but also in sociology. So it's called the original fluent society. And that's hunter-gatherers, or the more modern terminology now is foragers, because foragers includes and honors the work of both the male and females in the culture. Hunter-gatherers, you know, hunter, it sounds like that's where most of the calories come from, and it's challenging and exciting. And the women are out just there gathering fruits and berries and things. Well, that's true, the women are, but it turns out from research that it's the gathering that provides the vast majority of calories to foraging culture. So that's why that change came about. So, um, you know, they have been termed and dubbed the original affluent society because they have everything they need and they have a ton of free time, right? Okay. They work an average of about 2 to 5 hours, okay, a day, work as we would think of it, hunting and gathering, okay. Uh, they're, they have, they can get everything they need for survival during that time. And so they work, as I said, 2 to 5 hours. They do time allocation studies on these folks. And so they work 2 to 5 hours per day. They secure a diet that's comparable nutritionally, actually, usually better than what we eat. Um, so they comparable with our own in calories, protein, other nutrients. And the rest of the day, if you've ever looked at National Geographics, what do you see people doing? Hanging around in hammocks, right? Or weaving baskets, or carving flutes, or making tools, or bows and arrows. You know, they're playing with babies. There's always lots of babies and children in those photos, and so that's what they get to do most of their time, and sleep and take siestas, because 2 to 5 hours a day does it for them. Now, what's the 2 to 5? Well, the more temperate climate you're in, the less time it takes to meet your survival needs. The If you get into the Arctic and places like that, there's where it's tougher and harder, then there's that. It takes more time to do that. So those other needs that I talked about just a minute, what they're doing with most of their time is their higher needs, making things, playing music, telling stories, that type of thing. Okay. Um, and so the other thing that the text said that I love and that has been noticed by anthropologists who go to do field work with foragers is that almost everyone's an artist of some kind or another. It's just really very interesting, and that's because they have models of everybody doing it and they have time to do it. So what we are too busy mostly to develop our artistic side, and it's makes me so sad that children don't have models within, often, or I would say most of the time, probably within their homes anymore, of people making things, fixing things, cooking from scratch, all of those things that involve aesthetics and taste, feel, the senses, that type of thing. Because when you can do something, when you can make something well, you develop a sense of mastery. And that's crucial for children's development and feelings of self-worth and value. So that's another thing we lose by being too busy to do those things. Uh, uh, Marshall Solins, who studied this and came up with the term the affluent society for foragers, said that what we have inherited in Western culture is the biblical sentence of life at hard labor, which was uniquely passed upon us. And that, of course, comes from being, the Garden of Eden story, and where everything was just there, easy, like for hunter-gatherers, relatively easy, the fruit on the trees, everything was there. And then got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and that's when life became extremely difficult. And that's kind of our founding story, isn't it, in the West, certainly in the Judeo-Christian West. So, the other thing about foragers to understand is that they move around a lot, okay? And they don't just wander around. It's called a seasonal round. So let's take where we live now, or where many of us live in Coos Bay, North Bend, the coastal regions of Oregon. You go down to the mouth of the rivers when the salmon are running, right? You don't live down there year round. You go down there when the salmon are running. When the berries are ripe up more in the hills, then you go up there and you do the berry gathering or the other type of things that you're doing. You move around, but you come, it's a round. It's called a seasonal round, and you come back. And so you obviously can't have a huge amount of possessions, right, to haul around if you're moving, several times a year around. So one of the things about that is that it really disturbs Westerners, right? They were perceived as being kind of shiftiness, that there was so much movement. They weren't settling down. Well, think of the term settlers, right? You plunk yourself down and you stay in one place. It wasn't just the settlers, it was the conquerors who came in and took over countries or cultures as well. But that idea of shiftiness and laziness because they weren't working hard all day, that type of thing. And the idea was that they should settle down and do something productive, like raise crops. That's how Manifest Destiny happened in the United States, that the white people were destined manifestly by higher powers to take over the whole country from sea to shining sea because the people who were originally here weren't using it properly. They weren't settling down. They weren't planting. They weren't, some were, of course, but you know what I'm saying. Okay. So this is and then what really disturbed the Westerners on top of that was that they had an apparent disregard for the value of material goods. They just didn't, they weren't a huge emphasis, right, in their culture, even though from the Western perspective, it looked like they were living in some kind of relative poverty. They weren't, of course, original peoples in different countries, but it looks that way to Westerners with big houses and, all that kind of stuff. So you can understand, though, why carrying around a bunch of possessions, as I said, doesn't work for a seasonal round. I want to tell you my school bus story. You can see this is just one little tiny part of my space behind me. I live in a big house with a lot of stuff that I've accumulated over many years. And a lot of it, some of it I've made or someone near to me has made. But there was a period of time when I lived in a school bus with my husband and my small child, 2.5-year-old daughter. We traveled across the country. And I've thought about that often. We had everything we needed in that 8x40 school bus. It was just, it's amazing when I think about it. How did I do it? I don't know, really. I mean, I have memories of it and how we did it, but God, we had great clothes. I made most of them. I sewed by hand even because I didn't have a sewing machine, obviously, in the bus. It just, it's so interesting to think about how minimal that was and also how freeing it was because we were moving, right? So I'm glad that I had that experience, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because I know it can be done. So the other point is, and that's why I brought up sewing clothes and that type of thing, you don't need to carry around, these foragers and hunter-gatherers didn't need to carry around a bunch of stuff with them because they could remake anything they needed. The natural materials were all there for weaving baskets and carving and making tools and that type of thing. The other thing is that you should know is that the things they made that were things to use, that were useful, were beautiful. Okay. If you ever go to the Burke Museum in Seattle and see, I mean, this is true of almost all cultures, but the Pacific Northwest cultures, amazing carvings. I'm sure you've seen some of the masks and those types of things. They have a great display there, which may be being returned. I'm not sure. There's been controversy about that for years, but I'm sure some of it is still there. And even fish hooks, were carved with little designs, or, the fish themselves, or whatever. Every tool was beautiful. Okay. So, and the other thing is that consequently of all that stuff I just said about them, they don't have the concept of private property in the way we do at all. There's a very funny scene in Dances with Wolves where one of the wind in his hair, the Native American man asks the U.S. soldier he likes his shirt or some piece of clothing he has on something, and he says, "Give it to me." And the American soldier goes, it's very confusing to him, but he finally gets it. Oh yeah, you better give it to him, because then the native person will give it to someone else, and if he doesn't, it will have the energy. The Huas will see in another later on here, the spirit of the person that he got it from. But it's not there. This private property idea is not powerful in forager cultures. Now, is it perfect? No, of course not. It's not Edenic, like Eden, right? Like the Garden of Eden before the fall. They move often. They have to keep the population low. Now, I want to have a little argument with our text on this population. They are focusing on infanticide. And usually that's done by exposure, just leaving an infant out. Think about in the Arctic. It wouldn't take very long and would be relatively painless for an infant to die, being exposure, it's called, being exposed. But that's not the main way fertility is controlled in foraging societies. And I think it's because these folks who wrote the book are not anthropologists, that they're not pursuing this a little bit deeply. And I didn't want to leave you with that concept. What happens is the more body fat a female has, the more fertility. In fact, body fat has to be, and I re-Googled this because I can never quite believe it, it has to be between 22 and 28% for fertility, okay? If you looked, once again, at those National Geographics or the films or whatever, you're not going to see any overweight or pudgy people in those cultures. They're very lean. They're getting great nutrition, but they're very, very, very lean. And fertility is low in those cultures. It's just low. Women do not have a lot of babies. Let me give you another example. I put down in my notes, tell them the chipmunk story. Okay, so I started feeding birds here years ago, where I live out in the woods. And that was great. I loved seeing, particularly the blue jays and other birds come and eat. And then I started noticing after about a year or so, we always had some chipmunks, and they're cute and they're fun to look at. Pretty soon we were overrun. I am not kidding, with chipmunks. It seemed like hundreds of chipmunks. Somehow they weren't so cute anymore. They were more like, I realized, oh, those are rodents. Okay, they're cute rodents, but they're rodents. And there were just way too many of them. And I started paying attention, and what happened was, of course, they were eating tons of the bird food. And even though the jays are somewhat, they were bigger than the chipmunks in many cases, and, seemed to be somewhat aggressive with their cawing and all of that, they didn't run off the chipmunks from the bird feeder. They would actually, when the chipmunks came, they would kind of hang out and not go get the bird food until the chipmunks left. So I had to stop feeding birds. Here's my correlation with body fat and fertility. And guess what? It didn't take long. Now we're back to having a few cute chipmunks, but no, we're not overrun with them. Unfortunately, I still don't have I don't have the bird feeder up, so I have to find a place for it the chipmunks can't get to. Okay, so don't think that the only way or the primary way that fertility is controlled among foragers is by infanticide. That's simply not true. They just have a naturally low birth rate because of their diet primarily. Okay, let's look at consumerism modern style, and that's Affluenza. I put that film up for you. Yes, it's an old film, but man, if anything, it's worse today than it was when the film was made. So they talk about, they start this section in the book about one of the great American sins is being late, right? We really don't like people who are late, particularly cultures who are late. It's really quite interesting, I think. And the question then is why? Why is being late such a bad thing to be in our culture? And it's really because we have so little time. And so it's we we're always in a time crunch. And so if someone's late to something, then they're taking time away from our minimal amount of time. So look at the film clip. I'll probably refer to this to a couple of times on France. It's going to blow your mind to use a dated expression about how that society is set up so that people have uh, plenty of time. And it's by law. Okay? Or they certainly have plenty of time compared to us. And so do Scandinavian countries. They really have a lot. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. So this idea of time is very, very cultural. I think it's so interesting, this story about the indigenous man and his watch. And he kept asking the Westerner to what time it was by the Westerner's watch who was there in that country. And finally, the Westerner said, the guy asked him so many times what time it was, and he said, "Let me see your watch." And he looked at the watch. He looked at the indigenous man's watch, and there was a hand missing. It didn't work at all. And the guy's comment was to somebody else, "Why are these people so ignorant?" And as your text says, actually, the fact that the indigenous man's watch did not work was a sign, but he wore it anyway, was a sign of sophistication, because he had figured out that the watch was a status symbol. He didn't need it to tell time anyway. He's an indigenous person. He can tell time, particularly, as they said, at a latitude where this culture lived, at a latitude where the day length and the path of the sun doesn't really change much through the year. All he had to do was check the sky to know what time it was. But he knew that having a watch was a status symbol. Just seeing it on your wrist didn't, that was important. But so the other thing that the watch did, though, was it gave this indigenous man an awareness that he hadn't known previously, which was that he was poor compared to others. Okay. So, and thus he wanted the status symbol of the watch. So interesting. So how often do we have things or copies of things because of the status that it imparts to us? Now let's look at the theory of the leisure class, Thorstein Veblen. It's, as you saw, a very old theory, but it's still very appropriate in many ways, although we're going to see some other theories that just like with the hierarchy of needs, you got to go, yeah, but a little bit. But it's an important theory and important to understand. And you'll hear that terminology throughout your academic career or reading and that type of thing, the theory of the leisure class. And what it is, it's the awareness that lies behind modern materialism, this theory of the leisure class. So for most of American culture, our attempts to signal our comparative degree of power comes through conspicuous consumption. This was Veblen's theory. So three things: conspicuous consumption, conspicuous leisure, and conspicuous waste. So let's look at conspicuous consumption first. It's probably the one you're most familiar with. So the key point here is it isn't enough to be socially powerful. You have to display that you're socially powerful. I mean, it's great to be socially powerful, but what if nobody knows it? There's a need to display that you are. And because power in itself, as they point out, is not easy to see. It's not material. So what display shows is that we are powerful in a material, physical way, and it is comparative power. I have more power than you because look at all the very expensive stuff I have. So I have the money to buy that expensive stuff, and the money makes me more powerful than you. Okay. So it's partly about showing wealth, but it's also about the environment, because what that conspicuous consumption and display shows is that I don't have to pay attention to the environment, I'm not limited by the necessities of material life, because I am powerful enough and wealthy enough to be able to have all these things that are much more, that represent much more than the necessities of life. Okay, having a vehicle in modern life is pretty much a necessity, unless you live in a New York City or someplace that has good transit. But let's say just in general. But what kind of car do you have? Okay. Well, the more expensive the vehicle, the more that displays that you have power, and you don't have to just buy some clunker car out of just pure environmental necessity to get around. You can buy this very special fancy car. You get the point. Okay. So what it means is that you're somebody who doesn't really have to engage in productive activities yourself, producing things, working in factories, that type of thing, because you are someone at the level with this display that actually commands the people possibly who work in the factories, or you have a you have you can command the environment through other people. What about people who have servants? That's commanding the environment, getting the stuff done that needs to be done around the place, uh, by hiring other people to do it. You're not doing it. Okay. And that's environmental power. Cooks, dishwashers, blah, blah, blah. In a personal life, that's environmental power. You don't have to do it yourself. Environmental power equals social power. So what's conspicuous leisure? Well, conspicuous leisure is more subtle, and it's the I like this terminology, it's the non-productive, not making anything, consumption of time. And so you're distant, you're removed, but through leisure, from the productive needs. So for example, both physically and culturally, you're removed. So you can take a 2-month vacation on your yacht through, on the Italian coast, right? Okay. Because you don't have to be back for anything, and you've got the money to do that. That's conspicuous leisure. Okay. And it also includes more subtle social refinements, which is the way we speak, table manners, a pristinely clean home. Remember, I mentioned hiring people to do that. And employment that's completely removed from environmental needs, such as lawyers or corporate CEOs, those type of things. So what's conspicuous waste? That is using excessive amounts of goods or discarding something rather than reusing it. And what that does is it elevates you above common concerns, right? I can just throw those cans out the window, right? The pop cans or the beer cans, because I don't need the money to recycle them. What you could do is give them to somebody who did need the money, right? And you see homeless people recycling cans and bottles all the time. So one of the things that strikes me about this is that we've all had to adapt to. I remember the shift it was for me is there's no more shoe repair shops, right? You don't have to repair anything, you just throw it away. In fact, there's a movement now. You could Google it probably and find about how to repair things, even your own cell phones, which they hate you to do. But apparently online, I heard a news story about that. So, but you can't really repair your own shoes unless you know how to do it and you have the right equipment, that type of thing. But I remember when they disappeared. I mean, there was one in North Bend, there was one in Coos Bay. Every town you lived in had 1 or 2 or 3 shoe repair shops because you had to repair you had to resole your shoes, etc. Well, not anymore. Okay. Another example of conspicuous waste that they give are huge gas guzzling power boats and vehicles and that type of thing. You obviously have no need to care about crucial survival needs with those vehicles. And there's also now vicarious consumption, vicarious leisure, and vicarious waste. Vicarious means it's done, there's another step beyond just doing it yourself or having it for you. Okay, so some examples of that, as the book gives, is parents who dress their children in very easily ruined clothes, which is vicarious waste. Send them off to the leisurely pursuit. You might disagree that it's a leisurely pursuit of college life rather than work, but compared to some horrible job at low pay, yes, college can be considered to be a leisurely pursuit, especially the very elite colleges, and being sent off with a new car and a credit card. Okay, that's not for the parents themselves, right? It's vicariously showing your environmental power and your social power through your children. And I love the example of worn out jeans that they give. Do you know that in Russia, probably, when did I hear about this? 10, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago. Worn out jeans in Russia imported from America, not the fake ripped ones that they have now. I was in a store the other day and saw a whole rack of, fake torn up jeans, but in the Russian ones, and they were very, very, very expensive, like $100 in Russia, American, what would be the equivalent of 100 American dollars to buy those, because they were a status symbol. Okay. So, two important ecological consequences or implications of this conspicuous consumption situation. One of them is the subtlety of conspicuous leisure. It's not as nearly as obvious as other kinds, and so there's this invisibility around good table manners and excellent food and vacations. But I have to disagree with the book again. That is much more visible because of social media now. That's the kind of thing people put on their social media to make it look like conspicuous leisure, even though they may be having an awful time, or it took every dime they had, or they went deeply in debt, more commonly, to go on those vacations or whatever. But it looks like you're part of the leisure class, right? Because here you are. So, and conspicuous consumption is conspicuous consumption, leisure, and waste are both competitive, right? I got a better car than you do, I got a bigger house than you do, and they're comparative. So, and it's usually the comparative is less damaging than the competitive, because for competition to be noticed, you have to really exceed the prevailing norm. Um, and those levels of competition of who's got the best vehicle, who's got the best clothes, who's got the best vacation continue to escalate, right? So you're constantly in this level of this kind of competition. What are positional goods? Okay, and the question, this theory of positional goods came out of an economist named Hirsch's question is, why is there so much scarcity in the world? Or it certainly is perceived to be so much scarcity, and for some people there is a lot of scarcity, okay? Well, as he points out, it's not only due to the physical limits that are out there environmentally, but also to the social limits. So what happens is shortages occur when the demand exceeds the supply. Okay, that's pretty obvious. But it's a feedback loop, right? People want things because they are in short supply, because that they got it. See, they were able to acquire it. Now, COVID and toilet paper is an example of this. Do you remember when COVID first started and there was a run on toilet paper? Well, it was the run on toilet paper that made it in short supply. If everybody bought the same amount of toilet paper they always bought, there would not have been a short supply of toilet paper. But happens commonly, as you know, people rushing to buy something when they fear it may not be available, stocking up on it, which creates a short supply, which creates a greater demand, which makes the prices rise. So, Scarce goods are also an opportunity for status and prestige for those who could gain access to them. You could think about real jewels, as opposed to this. There are diamonds and things of that nature. You should watch a film called Blood Diamond if you haven't, to see what that nightmare is about, how diamonds are mined, etc., and what happens to the people who do that mining. So those are called things that are difficult uh, and are scarce or hard to find, right? Are give prestige and status to people who are able to acquire them. And those things, the difficult things to attain, are what are called positional goods. They basically, once again, short supplies, limited access, higher prices, things that have that. So positional goods, that concept helps us to understand the pressures that can result in the extinction of the species of a species. So the rhino horn is one of the examples that your book is giving you, but think about elephant tusks and ivory as another one. Tigers, there's a whole thing about tigers, as you know, currently in the culture. And then the story of the fennel plants that were probably the best birth control ever known to human beings, that's in your book, in Rome, and they used it till it was gone. And it wasn't just birth control; it was also used for. But that was probably from the article I read about that years ago in Anthropology, in an anthropological magazine. That was the primary use for it. It was very limited, but there was enough for everybody if they just managed it properly. It was also used, it was a form of fennel, so it was used in cooking and sprinkling on food and that type of thing. And when it got down, as it says in your book, to the single last plant on Earth, it was sent to the Emperor Nero so that he could put it on his food. Okay. So that's kind of what happens when things are in scarce supply and people, and the rhinos are endangered, elephants are endangered, tigers are endangered. We could go on and on. Okay. So now there's more to people than just gaining power and prestige, right? So this next section is called goods and sentiments. Do material objects have sentimental or feeling value? Yes, they do. They do. So many sociologists ascribe all human behavior to just totally to self-interest, right? So, but the key is we're equally motivated by sentiment, and the sentiments are involved with our social ties, right? That's where the sentiment comes from, our ties with others. So let's look at the reality of that, of sentiments, and look at the way we cultivate meaning in objects. The principal way we do that, as we just said, is through social ties. And because the goods that we value show not only how we set ourselves apart from other people, which is Veblen's, the leisure class, but how we connect to others, right? And they are beautifully put into your text, the talismans of community. Okay. So they use examples of logos and t-shirts with sayings on them and that type of thing. They connect us in some cases and tell people who we are and how we feel and what we think. They are part of what sociologist Irving Goffman called the presentation of self, right? You can tell an awful lot about what people care about, what their sentiments are, through their presentation of self, what they wear, I used to tell my students, once again, in the offices, look at your faculty's offices and you can tell what people care about. Is there art on the walls or, what? So those are sentiment feelings more than conspicuous consumption feelings. For example, I have a lot of my grandmother's jewelry, and these earrings, this ring are my grandmother's. They are part of her on my body. I feel that very, very, very much. So that's an important thing to think about. So that kind of goes against the idea that we act only out of complete, and this started in economics, right? That we only act in our own self-interests. A key point is here, as we understand them, because we often act against our own self-interests, right? I mean, this whole class is about human beings acting against their own self-interests in so many ways, because it's your self-interest isn't served by this human beings not being able to live on the earth, okay? But that is overlooked much of the time. So this theory, particularly from economics, that we only act out of self-interest, and that's called the theory of rational choice. And that people are obviously, from the terminology, that people are motivated by personal self-interest. So there's evidence mounting that theory is is a pretty narrow way of thinking about what is behind human behavior. And the theory, part of it is, like all theories, I guess, it's an ideal in itself. It really is creating by promulgating the idea, by saying, oh, we're all just self-interested and, that type of thing. It creates a world in which amassing material goods becomes the ultimate motive and purpose. Okay. And it also makes the interest of one seem to be opposed to the interest of all, which is the exact opposite of the all for one and one for all paradigm that we need to survive here, to make it all work for us. So that idea of we're acting rationally, and that rationality is based on self-interest, is not necessarily true, but it's a powerful idea, right? And you hear it over and over and over. And the more something's repeated, right, the more it kind of gets into your brain as truth, whether it is or not. So, in other words, there's a lot more going on than just raw self-interest here. There are things like certainly mutual aid is a motivation for a lot of people. Donating to charity is an example of that. Not taking a job that's more higher paying, but that leads to some sort of environmental destruction. Some business that is environmental destruction. I made a choice like that after my last employment years ago in the private sector. And it wasn't environmentally destructive. It was just, I was in the advertising and marketing department trying to sell people high-end intercoms for their fancy homes, right? And when I left that job, I decided I'm never going to work for profit again. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to figure it out. And I never have. I worked for Head Start. I wrote the Head Start grant for Coos and Curry County. I worked there for 9 years, and started teaching. And I must say that that's not been in my self-interest economically or financially, but it's been in my self-interest for the way I feel about myself, for sure. Okay, so those are some examples of that. And I love the idea of hua, the H-A-U, the Maori term for the social spirit that attaches to gifts. That's why I mentioned my grandmother's earrings and things. These aren't gifts. I got them after she died, but you get the point. And the point that virtually I like this. I'm going to point this out to you, that in Maori, the word for gifts is for both gifts and spirit is wind and spirit, and that in Latin spiritus also means wind and spirit. Could mean wind and spirit either way. Kind of interesting. So all people generally recognize that there is some presence in some things. Okay, you think about that. They give the example of wedding rings, and I think that's a very good example. Of would you sell your wedding rings? They mean even if somebody offered you more than they're worth, In dollars, their meaning is, if you've got a good marriage and you're still married, their meaning is much deeper than what they're worth, or what someone would pay you for them. And you can think about the, other gifts that you've received, and how you remember that person, right? When you see that gift or use it. So this shows that goods aren't just material objects, right? Or objects of social competitiveness and social interest. They also are in a web of sentimental ties. And sentimental doesn't mean the way, we think of sentimental of, all mushy and weepy. It means ties that have feeling or that have sentiments associated with them. Um, so knowing that, as clever marketers and advertisers do, they use that to get you, they use that to get you and Affluenza really talks about that. And with children's advertising, it's just, oh, anyway. So companies try to persuade you that products that are not socially and ecologically completely empty, that they aren't when they really are. And they do that through appealing to sentiments. But I want to go back to the completely empty ones. Think about the dollar store. I keep meaning to bring that up if I haven't already in this discussion. Just walk into a dollar store. The name tells you one of the major problems there, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, that everything only costs $1. Not one thing is made in the United States in those stores. And they are what was just termed products that are socially and ecologically empty. So what advertisers often do is use words like you and love in their advertising. They use the Burger King "have it your way" example for a mass-produced fast food. "Have it your way" is really ironic, but whatever. And now they've changed it. Apparently, they recently switched to "be your way." Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That's kind of a philosophical statement that doesn't have anything to do with food, really. And then the Gap, peace, love, and tie-dye, and we could go on and on about the kind of marketing that I see lots of them, commercials, for instance, that have family and love and sentiment to sell you something. So environmental advertising, on the other hand, often things that deal with the environment often have to do with power and self-interest. So here's some names of agricultural chemical companies that are very often militaristic. Now, think who uses these products. Primarily, it's males, because they do the yard work, right? I'm being facetious, but stereotypically that's true. So insecticides are named things like ammo, battalion, conquest, whip, fusillade, pursuit, and of course the most common one, Roundup. And in I guess that's a combination of insecticides and herbicides. So what's the insinuation, of course, here is that you've got power over the environment, but sometimes the message is the opposite. Okay, it's trying to be environmentally conscious. So the Body Shop is an example your book uses. In A Poor Man Shames Us All, in all the Millennium series, that you might see some more of them this term, the Body Shop was a primary sponsor of that program, and they were completely, there was a whole scandal about them, that they were not environmentally good actors at all. They treated their employees horribly, et cetera, et cetera. But when you see the commercial, you get a perfect example of this discussion when you watch the beginning of A Poor Man Shames Us All. And also British Petroleum, one of the biggest corporate polluters, Deepwater Horizon oil spill was them, changed their logo from just BP on a shield to something that looks like a sunflower. So you'll feel warmer and fuzzier about them. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and there's a few more minutes of this, so we'll move into a second part, but it will be short.